Well, Dr. Bill Watson is in his 11th year at CCU. He received his undergraduate degree at California Polytechnic University, a THM from Talbot Seminary, and completed his PhD at the University of California at Riverside. Bill's area of expertise is 18th century British ecclesiastical history, and he teaches widely in the area of European and world history. So, Dr. Watson.
Western civilization, the upward march to truth and freedom. May sound hokey, but I believe every word of it. Tertullian, one of the church fathers, once said, "What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem?" He was actually responding to several other church fathers who were trying to incorporate or make a synthesis of Athens and Jerusalem. I would encourage CCU to continue to bring in Athens and Jerusalem. What did we get from Athens? Athens brought us democracy, Athenian democracy, of course. This is where democracy began. And truth-seeking. When I say truth-seeking, I think of the tradition of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. In other words, to not blindly believe the traditions and even the religion that we've been handed down, which could be superstition, but instead seek rigorously the truth. What do we get from Jerusalem? Limited government and the rule of law. You say, where do you get that from Jerusalem? Of course, Jerusalem to me means the Jewish heritage. And I would say, well, wait a minute. When the people of Israel wanted a king and Samuel went to God, what did God warn Samuel to warn the people about? If you get a king, he's going to raise your taxes. He's going to take your sons and raise armies and go conquer other areas. You don't need a king. And of course, we found that Saul did just that, and that Saul led the country astray. And of course, God lifted his hand from Saul. Another thing, limited government. When the government transgresses, they're removed. And that's what happened to Saul. Another lesson we can learn. And even King David, when he sinned with Bathsheba, for example, Nathan came and David was accountable to the law. In other words, no one was above the law. Everybody else at that time, all the other rulers at that time were the law. And that kind of leads us to Christianity. Christianity, of course, built on Jerusalem, has the two kingdoms idea. All these ideas, of course, make up what is Western civilization. The two kingdoms idea. Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world." He also said, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, render unto God the things that are God's." Really a separation of church and state that I see in the Gospels. In a way, he resolved that two kingdoms problem, the Athens and Jerusalem. There is Athens and there is Jerusalem. And in a way, they're separate, but in a way, they both inform our attitudes and the way we think. Now, let's talk about freedom. You say, freedom? I really think that Christianity is the most freeing religion that I've studied around the world. In fact, the Apostle Paul said, if Christ has set you free, you are free indeed. It was for freedom that Christ has set you free. Do not return to the yoke of bondage. By the way, these ideas of two kingdoms and freedom were picked up by Martin Luther in the Reformation. I know I haven't got to the Reformation yet, but how so? Well, he stressed that there were two kingdoms, and we were citizens of the kingdom of man, and also the citizens of the kingdom of God. Augustine, by the way, also came up with that. But also, I would like to remind you of Luther's essay, The Freedom of the Christian. The Christian man is more free than any other, subject to no one. The Christian man is a servant to all. What an irony that we are a servant to all, but we are freer than anybody. Now, what did we get from Rome? Of course, Rome was built on Athens. And I would say that the Roman Republic, don't think of the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic. Keep in mind that for the first 5 centuries, Rome was a republic and it grew. For the next 5 centuries, Rome was an empire and it deteriorated morally and in every way. But it was right at the apex or height of the Roman period, 1,000 years of Rome, 500 years of fall, of rise, 500 years of fall. And right at the fullness of time, Paul says, Christ was brought into the world. And as Rome started to fall as an empire, the church started to expand. And of course, that's really the basis of Western civilization as well. But the Roman Republic had Consuls, 2 consuls, by the way, not one, because they never trusted power to one person. They didn't want a king like the kings of the Etruscan kings who had ruled over them as tyrants. And they would have a senate, which would balance the consuls. They would also have a spokesman for the common man, the tribunes. They would have praetors, or court system. So you actually had a balance of power, which we have today in the Roman Republic. Obviously, that was lost when the Caesars took over. But that's when they started to crumble. Let's go to medieval now. Something amazing. I would say really the watershed was at the Crusades. As Crusaders went to the Middle East and came home, they brought back with them ideas from around the world. But at the same time, the Crusades caused Islam to draw in on itself, to become xenophobic. In fact, at the same time that Europe was opening to the world, Islam was closing. Ishtihad. What's Ishtihad? That has nothing to do with jihad. Ishtihad was actually free inquiry, openness. And at the same time as Europe was opening, Islam was closing. In fact, what makes the West great, at least with technology, is openness. Many people say that, well, Western civilization is Eurocentric. Nonsense. The traditions of Western civilization are open to any ideas that work, that are pragmatic. I would say what the West is the future. Not because the West is going to conquer the world, but the rest of the world will gradually realize what works. And the reason why we are what we are is because we've been pragmatic. We've discovered what works. Almost all the great ideas that made the West great and powerful came from other countries. Gunpowder, the compass, printing, paper, all came from China. Arabic numerals. Notice the Arabs weren't interested in our numerals, but we thought, well, these Roman numerals. Have you ever tried to do algebra or calculus with Roman numerals? Do you think if we still had Roman numerals, we would have gone to the moon? No, we needed to improve, and we found that Arabic numerals work better than Roman. Now, we could have said, wait a minute, we don't like these Arab ideas. We're not going to let their culture take over ours. Nonsense. We were open to what works best. That's what has made us great. The Arab Latin sail, the triangular sail, which Europe only had square sails. They had to go in the direction the wind carried them, or take down that sail and start rowing. Do you think Columbus would have discovered America if his men had to row? Once we adopted the Arab sail, that triangular Latin sail, it's called the Latin because Northern Europeans got it from the Latins, but the Latins got it from the Arabs, okay? We were able to explore the world with a compass. We were able to take over the world with the gunpowder. And we were able to record the thoughts of man and build upon them because we had printing and we had paper. But of course, what was Islam doing? We have nothing to learn from the infidel. They closed themselves off. In China, we arrived and they said, foreign devils, get out. We don't want to have anything to do with you. But Europe was learning from everybody else, learning good ideas. In this map of the world, Franz Boas was the father of anthropology. Prior to Franz Boas, anthropologists believed Darwinistic racism. They believed the West was great because the West was white and white was superior to others. Boas, however, spent most of his time researching in areas of people with color. And he came to the conclusion that the people of color that he met were just as, if not more intelligent than the white people he remembered back in Europe. And he said, it can't be racial superiority that is causing the West to... It's obvious the West is far above everybody else. What caused it? And he came to the conclusion, openness and interaction. Basically openness and interaction, but also geographically, you can be in a place where you are able to learn from your neighbors. In other words, the Americans did not advance very much because there was a huge ocean between them and the rest of the world. In fact, what part of the Americas really advanced? The center part of the Americas, Mesoamerica, the Aztecs, the Toltecs, the Mayas, which is in the middle. Why? Because they had ideas from the north and from the south. Okay, and what about the old world? The most advanced is in the middle. Okay, Africa was separated from the mainstream of the rest of the world by a huge desert, the Sahara. Australia was separated as well. But what was the center? I would say the 1040 window, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, India, China. And they had a Silk Road which connected them all, and they all learned ideas from one another. In fact, did you know that until the Crusades, the Middle East was the most advanced place on the planet. All the ancient empires, all the great technology began in the Middle East and spread from there. Agriculture, metallurgy. Something happened, and the people of the Middle East said, stop, we don't want to learn from anybody else. So not only do you have to be in an approximate area where you can learn from your neighbors, you have to be open to be able to learn from your neighbors. And when the Middle East stopped, Europe started, and Europe just expanded. And it was ideas from other people. Let us continue to keep an open mind, continue to be pragmatic. So anyway, what this brought on was the Renaissance and the Reformation in the 16th century. And what happened? Now that we begin to explore, we begin to open up world markets. According to Boaz, the more interaction you have with other cultures, the more you advance. The only part of the world that was having interaction with others was Europe. Europe was going to America, it was going to Africa, it was going to Asia, it was sailing all around. It was picking up ideas, new foods, new drinks. I mean, the other areas said, get out, white man, we don't want anything to do with you. What's interesting is Ching Ho, I'm sorry for this tangent, but Ching Ho was a eunuch in the court of the first Ming emperor. He wanted to explore the world. And the first Ming emperor actually allowed him over 150 boats. And they sailed around Indonesia, around India. They went into the Persian Gulf, into the Red Sea, down the coast of Africa, brought two young giraffes, back to the emperor. When they got back, the emperor was dead and his son was there. And his son was following the advice of the Confucian Mandarin scholars who said, these are foreign ideas, these will endanger our culture. If your culture is more important to you than anything else, and you close yourself off to the rest of the world, you will have a poor, impoverished, not only economically impoverished, but culturally impoverished civilization, or if it's a civilization at all. I'm sorry, I'm getting too carried away here. Oh, in the Renaissance and Reformation, especially with the Reformation, we begin to reject, I'll go back to that top one, we begin to reject tradition similar to Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and start thinking for ourselves, going on a search for truth with Luther, for Calvin. Instead of trusting the tradition of the church, we wanted to find out what Jesus really taught. And so it got us back into the Word. All of this, of course, has influenced Western civilization. And this leads us to the 17th century and the scientific revolution. I would say without the influence of Christianity, and Rodney Stark, who's one of the readings you have on your list, I really would recommend that. The impact of why the scientific revolution was in Europe. And he makes a strong point that it's our Christian roots. All of the early founders of science, Francis Bacon, Galileo Galilei, Blaise Pascal, Isaac Newton, all were very devout Christians. I could go on naming all of them. And some people, in fact, back at the University of California, a professor said, well, everybody was a Christian back then. I said, no, they were really Christians. I mean, they weren't just cultural Christians. I mean, for example, Francis Bacon was not just a monk, but he wrote more devotions than he did scientific work. Galileo, you should read his letter to the Grand Duchess Christina about how the integration of faith and learning should take place, and that obviously the sun doesn't go around the earth. We've been able to prove that. But where I still believe in the Bible, but we have to, maybe we shouldn't take everything in the Bible so literally. I mean, Jesus said, I am the vine. It does not mean we should literally take it to be that Jesus is a plant. So we need to integrate faith and learning. Blaise Pascal with the same way. I mean, again, it was Blaise Pascal who said there's a God-shaped vacuum in each man's heart that only God can fill through Christ Jesus. And yet you've heard of Pascal's gas laws, the cutting edge of scientists. Isaac Newton wrote more on theology than he did on science. In fact, I have, because I'm a good dispensationalist, I know most of you aren't, but I have his commentaries on Daniel and the Apocalypse, Daniel and Revelation, where he's trying to determine what the weeks of Daniel are, when the Lord is going to return. Isaac Newton, you don't hear that at the secular universities when they try to whitewash history. So not only truth-seeking in God's Word, but in the scientific revolution, we have truth-seeking in God's nature and studying God's nature. That leads us then to, that leads us to the Enlightenment. The scientific revolution, of course, was the 17th century and the Enlightenment, the 18th century. We have two strains of the Enlightenment. One I call getting off track. That's called the French Enlightenment. I know I've been accused of being an Anglophile and a Francophobe. But the more I study, and by the way, I am a historian of the 18th century, so I know whereof I speak. Instead, what's forgotten, the French want to take credit for the Enlightenment. Where did Voltaire get his ideas? He spent a long time in England and was really impressed with John Locke, Isaac Newton. A lot of his scientific ideas came from English scientists. His political ideas came from British political scientists. Okay? When you look at the British Enlightenment, you see the political philosophy of John Locke, religious toleration, and limited government. And then you see Adam Smith, free markets. Now, the funny thing about Adam Smith didn't come up with his own idea. I think I'll invent capitalism. He went into the marketplace and saw how things were working. What worked? Free markets worked. Now, the difference between him and Karl Marx is Karl Marx came up with his own intellectual system and then tried to force it by violent revolution on everybody else, and it failed. Pragmatism works. Adam Smith was a pragmatist. What worked? Free markets. Of course, getting off track, you get to Voltaire, Rousseau, Robespierre, and I would argue that the idea of Rousseau is what inspired Hitler, is what inspired Lenin, Stalin, Pol Pot, Mao. I could go on and on. Communism was built on Rousseau, I would say. And free markets and the freedoms of the West were built. And once again, the test of the West, the West passed with flying colors. Secular humanism and idealism? No, I would say rational Christianity. That leads us to the 19th century, and I'm almost through. In the 19th century, we see the age of colonialism, expansion of world markets. I would say the second age of globalization, the first age was probably in the Renaissance. Now we're in the third age of globalization in each major step. Getting off track, when many went over around the world and they saw that they could exploit other peoples of color around the world, they went for exploitation. But I want to say that it was the British that came up with white man's burden. And I'm not going to say that's negative. White man's burden may be condescending, but where other colonial powers went and raped the land, the British felt an obligation to bring the glories of Western civilization, to bring the rule of law, to bring democracy. And I would like you to just think about comparing French colonies with British colonies. Well, let's go to the Caribbean. Compare Jamaica with Haiti. Which is in better shape? Compare Hong Kong and Singapore with Vietnam and Cambodia. My point, if I were a person in an underdeveloped country, I would pray the British would get there first. Why? They brought John Locke and Adam Smith. They didn't bring Rousseau, Voltaire, and Robespierre. And I don't apologize for white man's burden. If we have the technology and the education, let's go and bring it. If we have Christ, let's go and bring him. I don't apologize for that. And finally, my last slide, is the triumph of the West. In fact, I have a book by Roberts called The Triumph. I know it sounds arrogant to say it, but why did the West has triumphed? You say, well, we have a little problem now with Islamicism. Don't worry, the West will triumph. And that's really the 20th century we found that. And that is limited government, personal freedoms, free markets, democracy, rule of law. But how did some people get off track in the 20th century? Basically, they followed the French pattern, and that is communism, right? Rousseau, actually, if you don't mind me picking on him. Nazism, narrow, cultural. I mean, our culture, German culture, instead of being open to ideas and what is pragmatic. You know, communism and Nazism has been defeated, but now we are dealing with Islamicism and what I call Putinism. Islamicism, of course, is we don't want the West. Putinism is we don't want the West. Isn't it surprising that we have Iran and Russia kind of working with each other more than we would like? I better turn things over now to Phil Mitchell.